Welcome to My Life. I'm John Ochins, and I'm here with Don Steiner for the second half of our interview with Don. We're privileged to have Don with us. Don has lived in Oxford since 1968. He's a World War II veteran. He was in the Navy in both the European and Pacific theaters. These are things we're going to get into during this episode. He has some well-known relatives going back a few years into his family history. He's a member of the VFW and the American Legion here in Oxford and of the First Baptist Church of Oxford. And he's also a GM retiree. Over 24 years, he was on the financial staff when he retired. We were talking about memories of your grandparents at the end of the last episode, and you mentioned their longevity was pretty good, especially on your mother's side. You had a grandmother who lived to be over 100 years old, is that right?
That's correct, 103 months actually.
So, you know, one of the things I've often expressed to people is that I regret the fact that I was never mature enough to ask the right questions of my grandparents when I was able. They left me too soon. But that may not have been the case for you. Do you remember any really good conversations with them?
Unfortunately, I think I relate very closely with what you're saying, because that happened to me too. Most of the information that I've discovered I got from the National Archives or other sources about our family. My father's father and uncles and great uncles that were involved in the Civil War. So I think back, like you probably have, about, gee, I wish I'd asked some questions. Why didn't I learn about this, and so on and so forth? Or even my mother. Why didn't I ask historical questions of my mother? And I don't know, I'm just caught up in living, I guess, and raising a family. And
well, one thing, though, that you do have that not everybody has is you have some publications. Even if you go back to your uncle during the Civil War, you've got poetry that he wrote.
Right.
And I don't know, do you have any letters or anything from your other relatives who were in the Civil War?
I do have from a great uncle that was in the Civil War. He was a colonel in the 8th Maine Volunteers, and he was in several battles. He was later breveted by Abraham Lincoln as a brigadier general, but he fought in several of the battles with his troops. When I went to Washington, D.C. at the National Archives, I was able to go in and pick up some of the letters that he had written to his commanding officers about different aspects of the battles that he was in. So that was extremely interesting. His name was John Rust, R-U-S-T.
That has to be a special feeling, to be able to peer into their lives like that and view the written word that they put on paper.
In the National Archives, I'm not sure if everybody's really aware of all the historical volumes of historical information that they have, but you can go in there and you go into a separate room or a room with a number of other desks in it, and they'll actually pull these records for you, and you can sit there and read them. They have copy machines, and you can make copies of those, which I did, and so it's just extremely wonderful that that's all still available.
And not only that, but your mother wrote a book.
Yes.
And you're able to read that right now.
Right.
And get a little picture of her personality, maybe.
Yeah, she wrote a book called Lydia, Seller of Purple, and it's a devotional for women's meetings, actually. And it was published by Moody Press. She had written some other children's stories that were published by them and by some other Christian magazines back then.
What year did you join the Navy?
June 17th, 1942.
1942.
So,
what was going through your mind in high school when the war began?
you know, it's hard for me to conjure that up. I don't really recall a lot, but of course Japan had invaded Pearl Harbor December 7th, 1941. So June of 42 was like 6 months later. And I guess I was caught up in the fact that of the war and others from Independence Township joining. And I happened to be 6th and my brother the 7th, ones that left Independence Township to join the service. And there were, I forget exactly how many, but a number of others that came along and joined the service or were drafted.
What did your parents have to say about that? Did they have any thoughts about you joining the service?
Well, I'm sure my father was excited that I joined the Navy, and my brother also, since he had been in the Navy in 1901 and served aboard the sailing ship, the USS Constellation. So I'm sure he was excited. I'm sure my mother was quite apprehensive about that, especially with 2 boys leaving. But my younger brother was at home, so that was a great deal of consolation for her.
Now, did you have to get special permission from your parents to join at age 17, or how did that work?
I tried to get in 2 or 3 weeks, 2 or 3 months before I was 17. And I recall my brother-in-law going down with me to the recruiting station, but they wouldn't let me in until I was 17. So I finally convinced the recruiter that by the 3 weeks prior to that, by the time I was 17, when I was 17, that he would sign me up. So he did, but actually I didn't leave till 3 days after I turned 17.
And we need to point out that this wasn't uncommon. A lot of guys were doing this back then.
Right.
So what was your first assignment in the Navy? You went for basic training. Where did you go for that?
Great Lakes, Illinois.
Okay.
And after boot camp, I was placed in what they called the Armed Guard, which were Navy gun crews on merchant ships that would be on tankers and freighters. During the war, all kinds of merchant ships still sailed the seas, but they had to have Navy gun crews on them. And so the first ship I got was a tanker, oil tanker. And I picked that up in New Orleans, and we made trips from Texas to New York hauling crude oil and getting German sub-activity off the coast of Florida. So that was rather exciting. Okay. And then from there I was on a small freighter, the SS Cornelia, and we made trips to the Caribbean, to Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, and Haiti, and back and forth. I jokingly say we hauled rum and Coca-Cola, but we really didn't.
Let's talk about that a little bit further after we take our next break. Okay. Don't go away. You're watching OCTV, Oxford Community Television, serving Oxford, Addison Township, and the village of Leonard. Back with Don Steiner, talking about your experiences in the Navy during World War II. Your second ship assignment was, well, you were on merchant ships, but
correct.
Your first one was an oil tanker, but your second one
was a small freighter by the name of SS Cornelius.
And what did they haul?
We just hauled all kinds of products. I don't recall specifically what we hauled, but we would take merchandise from New York into to the Caribbean, various islands there.
Was that your first adventure away from the United States?
Well, the tanker was actually.
Oh, they went away from the U.S. as well?
Well, they up and down, but it was.
Yeah.
But away from the States, correct.
Yeah.
That the Cornelia was the first one, but we went down the Caribbean.
But you said, did you have gun crews on board the ship because it was wartime?
That's correct. In fact, the first tanker was on. We only had a 3-inch gun on the bow, and we had a couple of 30 caliber Thompson machine guns. If you can imagine that, it was very, very sparse back there in the early part of the war, and then they armed them better as the war progressed. But they weren't armed very good right at the first part of the war.
So you were sailing to where again with this particular ship?
From New York to Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, and Haiti.
Okay. What were some of your memories when you first viewed those places?
It was just unusual and different. Never had been away from home basically until I got in the Navy. So those were just exciting, really exciting places to be, and unusual. One of the trips we made to San Juan, Puerto Rico, we were sailing with several other ships, and we dropped off the last ship, I believe, at Haiti. So we were by ourselves, which was very unusual, without any Navy escort at all. Prior to that, we'd had some destroyers and other ships with us to protect our crew fleet. But at this particular time, we were by ourselves, and we were sailing for San Juan. San Juan Harbor had what they called submarine nets, and these were large steel nets that they drew across the mouth of the harbor to prevent any ships, any submarines or anything from coming into the harbor. They would draw those across at dusk, and they would open them up at dawn. When we arrived there, it was about 7 o'clock at night, and we were advised by the port that we would have to stay out overnight and just circle around. And so we were doing that, and it was about 7 o'clock at night, and I happened to be on the bridge on watch with a pair of binoculars, and I observed what appeared to be a boat, a small boat of some kind, leaving a wake. And I couldn't identify it, and I called the captain and my Navy officer up to the bridge. They observed it also, and finally corresponded with the port, discovered that it appeared like it might be a submarine. It was leaving a wake similar to a submarine. So they notified us from the port that they would send a destroyer out. When the destroyer came out, we were to come in into the bay, which we did. The next morning, we got word that this destroyer had sunk a German sub out there, and so that apparently was the German sub that we observed. And all that history I have was on the log from the ship that day.
And you actually have some of that, don't you?
Yes, I do, yeah.
How did you get that?
I got that at the National Archives.
The archives?
Yeah, yeah.
What a remarkable
I
resource.
am very fortunate to have the deck logs from each one of the ships that I was on. So I'd been on actually 5 different ships by the end of the war, so I have the deck logs of that. So that's been immeasurable in trying to recall some of the history.
What was the third ship that you were on?
That was called a Liberty ship. That was one of the newest freighters that was being built at that time. The Liberty ships were plying the Atlantic, and many of them were going to Russia, and that was like a death trip because the German sub fleet was picking off ships one right after another. My buddy and I, who had been in boot camp and on both of these other ships together, were in New York Harbor, and we wanted to get on a Liberty ship. We were tired again being on older ships. So we asked if we could get on the same ship together again. Well, they didn't let us do that, but he was on a Liberty ship separate from me. And then we went over to the Mediterranean, and I ran into his ship, ran into him at Oran, Africa. So we spent an evening together, and then during that time, we made trips from North Africa to Sicily and Italy. We went to Oran, Africa, to Algiers, to Bizerte, to Tunisia, and all back and forth, taking the troops that had chased Rommel out of North Africa and taking those up to British and American trips up to Sicily and Italy.
How was your impression of the world changing the more that you saw of the world?
Well, you know, I was maturing much more than I thought that I was, because here I was exposed to things that maybe I read in a geography book or something like that, different countries, but here I was there in the middle of that, and so it was just extremely unusual. one of the significant times in when we made our trip into Naples, Italy, actually the first time we there were still German snipers in the city. But one of the other times was there was a large fenced-in area, and there were a number, hundreds of German prisoners of war in this fenced-in area there. And out in the bay, there was a German ship called the Friedlied in Germany, and that means freedom. And there was also a United States hospital ship. The hospital ship had German prisoners of war. The German ship had American prisoners of war, and they were exchanging prisoners. So in this area there in Naples, the German prisoners would have been then taken over to the German ship and sent back to Germany.
And this was while the war was still going on?
That's right, yeah. That would have been in 1943.
That had to have been a strange feeling.
It was unusual. One of the other interesting things that doesn't relate specifically to the war is when we came through the Straits of Messina, the straits going between Sicily and Italy. Mount Etna is in Sicily. Mount Etna was erupting. And when we got into Naples, Italy, across in the Bay of Naples is Mount Vesuvius. Mount Vesuvius was erupting. So it was just an unusual, I don't know if it ever happened that way since that time. I know they've erupted since then, but whether almost simultaneously that happened, I don't know. But that was just a moving experience to see both of those volcanoes erupting, in a very short period of time.
I want to talk more about that assignment, but we got to take a break right now, so stick with us.
Thank you.
Don Steiner, we'll be right back. Back with Don Steiner, where we're talking about your experiences during World War II. This was the European front now.
Right.
You were on a Liberty ship, and the American side and the German side were exchanging prisoners.
Correct.
Did you ever have a chance to talk to any of these guys?
No. I wish I had.
You never did?
No.
What was your assignment after that?
Well, then we came back to the States, and I was assigned to the amphibious forces. And we took our training in Norfolk, Virginia, and in Florida. And then I was assigned to a crew, and we went to Great Lakes, Illinois, to Navy Pier. And then as part of a nucleus of this crew, we were sent down to Louisville, Kentucky. They were building LSTs, large landing ships. It's called Landing Ship Tank LST. They also called it Large Slow Target. But anyway, they were building those at Jeffersonville, Indiana, across the river from Louisville, Kentucky. And we were part of a nucleus crew. We stayed at the YMCA there while that ship was being launched. And then we boarded it, went down to New Orleans, and it was commissioned in New Orleans. And then that was LST number 715. And we went from there to the Panama Canal and up to Pearl Harbor. And at Pearl Harbor, just prior to that, I was promoted to second-class boatswain's mate. So I had to get off of that ship because we had our complement full at that time. And was assigned to the LST 45, one of the earliest LSTs. And that ship had invaded Saipan and Tinian in Guam. And then when I was on it rather, we went and made the invasion of the Philippines when MacArthur came back, and then after that to Okinawa. And there's a small 5-mile wide by 10-mile long island off the west coast of Okinawa called Ishima, I-E, capital S-H-I-M-A, and that's where the famed war correspondent Ernie Pyle was killed. Well, anyway, we went into the beach and we jammed our bow doors on the coral reef. And the LST has 2 bow doors that open and a ramp that goes down. When we backed off of that after unloading our troops, we were able to close the ramp and close the bow doors. The ramp was watertight, so they sent us back to Guam eventually to have that repaired. And they couldn't repair it there. They sent us back to Pearl Harbor to have it repaired. They could not repair it, so they sent us to San Diego. And we were halfway between San Diego and Pearl Harbor on August 14th when Japan actually surrendered. The surrender documents were actually signed later aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd, 1945. But so we were back there at that time, and then I came home and later got discharged. November 1945 was discharged.
So I know your job was a little bit different when you were in the European theater and then in the Pacific theater. I guess you were maybe a little closer to the action in the Pacific theater because you were actually taking troops. But was there any difference in war between one theater and the other?
Oh, I think to a great extent, because the mindset of the Japanese at that time, the soldiers, dictated down by Hirohito itself, was that they would never surrender. And so it was an atrocious, more of an atrocious kind of war because they were not treated, the prisoners weren't treated as well as they were being German prisoners of the German. In fact, I just read that Wake Island, that the Japanese had murdered 100 of the prisoners on Wake Island. So that was a terrible part of the war. And in that part of the war, in the Okinawa and Philippine operation, especially the Philippines, that's when the Japanese kamikazes, the pilots that would pilot a plane and crash it into a ship, that's when all that began to happen. We were in a bay in Leyte in the Philippines when 2 kamikaze pilots came over. I recall distinctly, as if it were yesterday, our anti-aircraft guns firing on this kamikaze plane as it came over our port side and went around our fantail. It dove into a freighter that was unloading equipment onto a barge next to it and set it on fire. Within just a few short minutes after that, another kamikaze came over and it dove into another Liberty ship at that time. So within that just few minutes of time, we experienced first-hand kamikaze pilots. So it was, I've never been more scared in all my life.
You saw a lot of death.
When I was at that particular time.
Yeah. What went through your mind when you said you were headed back for California when you found out that the peace treaty had been signed with Japan surrendered? What went through your mind then? What am I going to do?
Yeah. Well, I think probably that. Really glad for an opportunity to get out of the war, that the war was over, and then come back home, you know, and so it was that kind of an experience that I recall.
What did you end up doing when you finally got out of the Navy? What was your first job?
Well, my first job was painting ducks, D-U-C-K-S, yellow, in a little shop down in Pontiac, little painted wooden ducks. That wasn't very adventurous. But eventually then, I went to work for a plumbing and heating contractor in Pontiac that later moved to Detroit. And I worked as the office manager and accountant for that company, and for several years. And
you worked as an office manager and an accountant. Now we're talking about a kid who had not yet quite graduated from high school.
Yeah.
Where did you pick up some of these skills?
Well, I went to Pontiac Business Institute, which was a good organization.
When was that? Was it after you got out of the Navy?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And
while you were painting ducks?
Yeah, after.
Okay.
I got tired of painting ducks, and I thought pushing pencil might be a better occupation. But anyway, then I went to work for this plumbing and heating contractor, and then shortly after that, I joined Burroughs Corporation. I joined a company by the name of Charles R. Hadley, which became merged with as a division of Burroughs Corporation. And I sold accounting systems. So I had my first sales territory, although I was operating out of Detroit, was in Toledo, Ohio.
At what point did you get involved with General Motors?
It was after that. I worked for 3 years in Toledo, Ohio with Burroughs, and then Dayton, Ohio for 3 years, and then was transferred to Louisville, Kentucky for 3 years. And then I left and come back to Michigan, and in 1967 came back to General Motors Truck and Bus Group. But prior to that, I'd actually started with GM in 1949 and 1950, worked in their engineering weight and cost department and their material control. Then they were laying off people back then, so I got laid off and then went with Burroughs later. And came back in 67.
You worked for some pioneering companies, didn't you?
Yes.
You saw a lot of changes in a lot of things. How did you find your way to the financial end of things with General Motors?
Well, of course, through my work with in Burroughs and selling accounting systems, so that gave me the accounting background. And when I came back in 1967, I came back to hourly payroll department as a timekeeper. And that company, then I was transferred to what they called property records, which later became appropriations analysis. And so I spent all the rest of my time in the appropriations department and eventually became supervisor there.
Now that we've talked about you becoming an executive with General Motors, let's talk about how you graduated from high school. That's a great story. Why don't you tell us?
There was an article in the Oakland Press that the state had approved a bill allowing high schools to award high school diplomas to veterans who left the war, left school to join World War II. So I filled out an application, sent it to Clarkston High School, and I received a call from the assistant superintendent one day and saying that they wanted the superintendent, the assistant superintendent, the principal, wanted to meet with my wife and I and discuss my receiving a diploma. They advised me that I was to come to the school board meeting and they would give me my diploma.
What year was this, do you remember?
That would be 2002. Early part of 2000, well, probably.
And they saved you a few seats in the front, didn't they?
Yeah. They actually gave me my diploma at the board meeting, but then I was advised we were going to have the graduation at Pine Knob, and I was to come there for the graduation exercises. When I got there, the assistant superintendent said, "We saved 20 seats out in front for your family, but you're to sit right here in the front seat and lead all of the honor students and other graduates on the diploma." I said, "No, my name is Steiner, I belong," and the S is in the back. And they said, "No, you're going to do this." So anyway, that's how that happened, and it was just hard to believe.
We're kind of running out of time, unfortunately. There's so many more things we could talk about, but I always like to ask my guests one last question. If you had it all to do over again, would you change anything?
I don't think I would. Yeah, there are a lot of things I wish were different, perhaps, but these are just wonderful memories. The family and being married now for almost 42 years to Marjorie, I wouldn't change a thing.
Yeah. Well, thank you for being with us. We've been privileged to have you. Don Steiner.
Thank you.
We'll see you next time.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it. Thank you.
My pleasure.